So good afternoon, members of the New York City community, students, public health professionals, government officials, healthcare providers, administrators, educators, local residents, and fellow crusaders. I'm Virginia Rao, Columbia University faculty member. I direct CHILD, a Mailman School of Public Health initiative, of the Child Health Initiative for Learning and Development, and co-direct the new initiative, Trauma Free NYC, which you'll be hearing a little bit about. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming you, our guests, and introducing our distinguished speaker. Today's event honors and informs the trauma-free movement across the city and the country. It's a movement to transform how we respond to early childhood adversity and the resulting toxic stress that dramatically impacts our health and longevity. The event is sponsored by Mailman's Child Initiative, the Columbia University Center for Science and Society, and the University Community Partnership, Trauma Free NYC. A few words about the partnership. This new partnership is focused on identifying and promoting trauma-informed practices and policies in the city. We have the following 4 goals. First, to serve as a resource for the creation of a cross-sector coalition to make New York City a trauma-informed city. Second, to increase public awareness in New York City of the factors associated with ACEs and trauma experienced across the lifespan, with a focus on its lasting impact on development. Third, to promote research and demonstration activities on meaningful solutions to mitigate some of the harmful effects of childhood adversity. And last, to design educational, training, and service learning programs in trauma-informed practices, both at Columbia University and for the wider New York City community. Many members of the Trauma Free NYC Partnership are on hand today wearing identification badges to greet you and help with some of the flow of events. We welcome your questions and involvement and have provided an information sheet with hopefully some of you picked up at the sign-in desk with all of our contact information. This is the first event in a series of educational and informational events focused on the biological basis of optimal child development, so please stay tuned. I'd like to thank all the members of the Trauma Free NYC group for their hard work, and in particular, Program Officer Danielle Cassow, and our tireless MPH students, Rebecca Grant and Jacqueline Alfrich, for pulling us together and keeping track of details. To that end, they've asked me to let you know that the restrooms are located 1 floor below where you entered. Just keep on following the marble staircase down until you get to the black and white tile. And also to remind you that the reception will take place downstairs immediately following the talk with the book signing. Also, please silence your phones if you haven't already done so. Now, a pioneer in the field of medicine, pediatrician Dr. Nadine Burke is a leader in the trauma-free movement. By exploring the science behind childhood adversity, she brings us a new way to understand adverse events that affect all of us throughout our lifetimes. As the founder and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness in San Francisco, she has brought these scientific discoveries and her new approach to audiences across the whole country, to the Mayo Clinic, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Google Zeitgeist, and Dreamforce. Dr. Burke Harris's TED Talk, How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime, has been viewed more than 3 million times. Her work has been profiled in The New Yorker, in Paul Toe's best-selling book, How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character, and in Jamie Redford's feature film, Resilience. Dr. Burke Harris's work has earned her the Arnold P. Gold Foundation Humanism in Medicine Award, which was presented by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Heinz Award for the Human Condition. She serves as an expert advisor on the Too Small to Fail initiative to improve the lives of children, and the American Academy of Pediatrics National Advisory Board for Screening, And finally, Dr. Burke Harris has written a new book on the issue of childhood adversity and health. This book, entitled The Deepest Well, Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity, goes on sale to the public tomorrow. Please join us for the reception downstairs following the talk, where advance copies are available for purchase and signing by Dr. Burke Harris. This event officially launches the New York City book tour, and we all expect the book to be a bestseller. Welcome, Dr. Burke Harris.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here, and very much because the folks in this room are on the forefront of this movement to transform the way our society responds to adversity in childhood, to offer new opportunity for the next generation. And before I start, I just gotta say, thank you so much to Rebecca Grant, who in any case, I won't tell the whole story, but I'll just say Becca's been my home girl, my right-hand woman, working with us at the Center for Youth Wellness for 3 years. We were very sad when she moved on, but hey, she came to Columbia to do her MPH. So, you know, this book feels like very much like a child to me, like the baby I've been gestating for the past 2 years. And it starts with the story of discovery, right? When I finished my residency at Stanford and decided to go and work in Bayview Hunters Point, which is one of the most low-income and underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco, I had no idea what I was embarking on, right? I thought I was gonna hang a shingle and use all the medical training that I had learned to provide the best quality care I could to a community that was in incredible need. But as I, went into my practice, I started noticing a disturbing trend. And I will have to say, because we are talking about public health, that it really was my public health training, right? Because I did my MPH before I started my residency, that helped me be able to pull back from, writing those prescriptions for antibiotics and everything else, to be able to see that pattern. And the pattern that I was observing was that I had a lot of kids being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And when I did my job, right, I did what I as a physician was supposed to do, and I did a thorough history and physical. What I found was that over and over again, I was hearing a little bit of the same story, which is that oftentimes the kids that I was seeing with the most severe symptoms were also had really significant histories of adversity, right? Who were living in households where really difficult things were happening, whether it's abuse or neglect, or having a parent who was mentally ill and unable to get access to high quality mental health care, or substance dependent, or something along those lines. And then I also saw there was something else that was really striking. I remember one patient that really stood out for me was a young woman who was coming to see me for really severe asthma. And I had been, treating her with everything. I had her on all kinds of medications. And I sat down again with mom and said, okay, let's talk about your asthma triggers, all right? Is there, pet dander? Is the cockroaches, harsh cleaning products? Like, can you think of anything that we haven't eliminated that might be triggering your daughter's asthma? And she said to me, doctora, I noticed that my daughter's asthma tends to kick in every time her dad punches a hole in the wall. Do you think it could be related? And for me, putting these pieces together got me thinking differently about whether there was a connection between my patients' experiences and environments and their health. So then one day into my office walks my colleague, Dr. Whitney Clark, and in his hand is a research study. And Dr. Clark was a psychologist. We had been working really closely together to care for many of our patients. And he handed me this paper and he said, "Have you seen this?" And that day changed my clinical practice and ultimately changed, I would say, my whole life trajectory. And in his, that study was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And so I think this is a pretty familiar audience, but just to ground for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with the study, this study was done by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and Kaiser Permanente. And in it, they asked 17,500 patients about their histories of adverse childhood experiences. Now, these patients were, number one, adults, right? And number two, this population was not Bayview Hunters Point. This was Kaiser San Diego. So the population was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. And what they did was they asked them about 10 categories of what they called adverse childhood experiences. And these include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent was mentally ill, substance dependent, where there was parental separation or divorce, incarceration, or domestic violence. So for every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did, right, because this is Kaiser, this huge health system, they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. And what they found was absolutely striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs were incredibly common. 2/3 of their population had at least one adverse childhood experience, right? And 1 in 8 had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, right? That was almost 13% of their population. And remember, 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. The second thing that they found was that there was what they called a dose-response relationship between adverse childhood experiences and health outcomes, right? So the higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. So this is a list of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States of America. And having an adverse childhood experiences score of 4 or more is associated with double the risk for heart disease, 2.3 times the risk of cancer, triple the risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 2.5 times the risk of stroke, 11 times the risk of Alzheimer's, 1.5 times the risk of diabetes, 30 times the risk of suicide. Now, for folks who are familiar with the ACE data, some of these numbers may look a little different than what you're accustomed to. That's because these numbers have been updated with the global ACEs data that Hughes published in 2017, looking at ACEs in, I believe it was 23 countries globally. So some of these numbers have been updated, but these are the latest numbers. So now, wait a minute. We are dealing with a problem that most of the population has at least some exposure to, right? And we have fully, now since this has been done, this work has been repeated. This data is collected by the CDC now in 32 states and the District of Columbia. And all of those that report their data report between 13 and 17% of the population with 4 or more ACEs. 13 to 17% of the population, right? With double or more the risk of 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. How is it that I never heard of this problem in medical school or residency? So for me, as a doctor, when I saw this strong association, the first thing that came to my mind is, how do I use this science to help and heal my patients, right? So in order to be able to do that, I have to understand, how does this work? What is the mechanism, right? Because when we understand the underlying mechanism, then we can use that understanding for prevention and healing. And I'll give you an example. So back in the early 80s, long before I was in training, I believe I was in elementary school, you know, doctors started seeing high rates of folks coming into the ER with tuberculosis, right? With these rare pneumonias, pneumocystis pneumonia. It's very uncommon. All of a sudden, we're seeing incredibly high rates. With these, you know, weird kind of rare skin cancer, something called Kaposi sarcoma, right? But you know what? Tuberculosis, there's a treatment for that. We know how to treat tuberculosis. All right, here's your script, out the door. Pneumocystis pneumonia, yeah, we got antibiotics for that. Let me write that up. There you go. Kaposi sarcoma, yeah, we got a specialist who can treat that. I'm gonna send you to him. But wait a minute. If we don't know the underlying cause, we're gonna treat the symptoms, right? And still never get to the root cause. What's gonna happen? Patients are gonna keep coming back, and they're gonna be sicker and sicker and sicker. And by the way, our treatments are gonna be expensive, we're gonna be throwing our monies at them, and they're going to be only marginally effective. Because when I tell you the story, many people in the audience will recognize that the underlying cause, in this case, was HIV/AIDS, right? It was a virus that compromised the very immune system. So we could do a fantastic job at treating TB, but folks are gonna keep coming back, right? So understanding the underlying mechanism allows us to be more effective with our treatments. So in this case, right, how does the biology of adversity affect, you know, what I've been talking about here? So imagine you're walking in a forest and you see this guy, right? It's meant to scare you. I don't know if I'm doing a good job here. I just, like, imagine it's there in real life. Right? What happens? What happens in our bodies? Immediately, your amygdala, this is the brain's alarm, sounds the alarm to say, hello, you need to be terrified because that is a bear, right? And it activates this process in our bodies. Your brain sends a signal to your pituitary gland. That sends a signal to your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. And that says, release stress hormones, right? So you release adrenaline and cortisol, and they do their jobs. So what happens? Your heart starts to pound, right? Your pupils dilate, your airways open up. You shunt blood to your large skeletal muscles so that you can run and jump, and away from that itty bitty muscle that holds your bladder closed so you might pee your pants, right? And so you're ready. You're ready to either fight the bear or run from the bear. And that's our fight or flight response. Now, a couple of other things happen when our body activates the fight or flight response, right? So one is that if you were to think about it, fighting a bear might seem like a bad idea, right? He's got teeth, he's got claws, a grizzly can weigh up to 1,700 pounds, right? And that's why your amygdala, the brain's alarm, sends projections to your prefrontal cortex. It says, you know what, we're not gonna do a lot of thinking right now, so we're just gonna turn that down, right? And we're gonna turn up what's called the noradrenergic nucleus of the locus ceruleus, or as I like to call it, the part of the brain that's responsible for, I don't know karate, but I do know crazy, right? This is the within the brain stress response center, and it's responsible for getting you amped up, okay? Picture New England Patriots fans after a game. All right, so you got, the blood pumping, your brain has, is in reaction mode. And the other thing that happens when your fight or flight response is activated is that it also activates your immune system. Because if that bear gets you, you want your immune system to be primed to bring inflammation, to stabilize the wound, so you can either beat that bear or run away, right? It's brilliant. It's designed over millennia to save our lives from a mortal threat. But the problem is what happens when that bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging, right? And the changes that happen when a child's stress response, and children are particularly susceptible because their brains and bodies are just developing, right? So high doses of adversity in childhood are associated with changes in the structure and function of children's developing brains. They're developing hormonal systems, they're developing immune system, and even the way their DNA is read and transcribed. And these changes to the brain, the immune system, and the hormonal system, right, is what is now known to pediatrics and medicine as toxic stress. It's these long-term changes to the brain and body. And since the original research was done by the CDC and Kaiser, right, what we now know is that that research, the original research, was done in adults. And they asked which of these things, they looked at the health outcomes in adults based on their history of exposure to adversity in childhood. But I'm a pediatrician, right? And my question is, how do I use this information in real time? Well, since this research has been done, our team at the Center for Youth Wellness has scoured the scientific literature. And one of the things that we now understand is that the signs and symptoms of the body's reaction, the signs and symptoms of toxic stress, are evident as early as infancy, right? So in babies, what we see is developmental delay, growth delay, failure to thrive, and sleep disruption. In school-age kids, we can see asthma, increased risk of asthma, pneumonia, viral infections, atopic disease like eczema and allergies, learning difficulties, and behavior problems. And in adolescence, we see more of the obesity, diabetes, headache, abdominal pain, and then things like teen pregnancy, increased risk of autoimmune disease, and then also pubertal changes, right? All of these as a result of the disruption of the neuroendocrine immune system. Well, that sounds terrible, right? It sounds awful. You see all this stuff, and it's easy to look at it and say, oh my goodness, this is so overwhelming. How am I going to deal with all of this stuff? But for me, I feel like my reaction was the exact opposite. I was just like, yes, now we finally have the tools to be able to disrupt this process because we know how it happens. And so the first thing is understanding, what do we need to do differently? How do we take the science out of the journals, right? Our team looked at over 17,000 journal articles. 17,000 journal articles! And as a pediatrician, for most of us, it's not a damn thing we do differently than we did before all this research came out. I don't know about y'all, but I take my kids to the pediatrician, and the topic of ACEs never comes up. No one ever mentions anything about toxic stress. Nobody asks me, nobody screams, and I'm just like, how is it that all this science can be out there and we are not applying it to improve the health and the lives of children, right? So that is, if you guys haven't noticed, I'm a woman on a mission, right? Because we need to, thank you, we need to, this science is useless if we are not applying it to improve the health of children. So what does that look like? I'm going to give you an example, and it's one I talk about in the book, of a little girl named Lila. When she first came to see me, she was 2 years, 9 months old. And their family had just moved across the country, and she'd been seen by a pediatrician. She had gone to every visit. She had all of her vaccines, all of the above. And when she first came in to see me, by the way, this is a Caucasian family, blonde hair, blue eyed, beautiful little girl, came to see me. And the first visit, mom and dad came together. And then the second visit, mom came by herself for the well child exam. And she had an ACE screen as part of her routine well child exam, because that was one of the things that we implemented at the Bayview Child Health Center and the Center for Youth Wellness. We screen every kid. If we know that children are at risk, right, then we can wait until the biological process is so far along that these kids are manifesting symptoms and then react to those symptoms. Or we can do what we learn in public health, right, and screen so that we can do early intervention. Because all of the science tells us the earlier we intervene, the better the outcome. So Lila got a routine screening as part of her physical exam. And when I asked mom in the physical, hey, any concerns you have, anything you're worried about? This mom said to me, no, not a thing. Well, she's little. She's itty bitty. I don't know. Is there something up with her appetite? And for any pediatricians in the audience, that's a very common complaint. Is my child eating enough, right? And when I looked at her growth chart, this is actually a picture of her growth chart, and it's a little tough for you guys to see, but this is a little girl. She started with her weight at the 25th percentile and her height at the 50th percentile. And over the course of her first 2 years of life, she dropped to below the growth curve. She fell off the growth curve for length, for weight, and if I showed you her head circumference, it'd be the same thing. She fell off the growth curve. This is the classic picture of what we call failure to thrive, right? Now, her previous doctor also had diagnosed her with failure to thrive and was doing the standard treatment, which was nutritional supplementation. I don't know if you guys have ever seen those, advertisements on TV for Pediasure, right? But he was giving her Pediasure, and it didn't seem to work. And so, after you try Pediasure and it doesn't work, the next thing you do is you start a workup looking at, genetic factors or neurologic factors and all this stuff. But he hadn't gotten there yet. So when Lila came to see me, I got the same information. This was actually, sent to me from her previous pediatrician. I got the same information, but I had one additional piece of information, her ACE score. It was a 7. So for this 2-year, 9-month-old girl, I said, before we do that big old workup, my number one thing on my diagnosis is toxic stress. And I said to this mom, I believe that because of what your child has experienced, her body may be making more stress hormones than the average person, and this may be what's interfering with her growth. I would like to refer you to a resource to help you with this. And I referred them to child-parent psychotherapy, which we had at our center because we have integrated primary care and behavioral health. This is Lila's growth curve after we started that intervention. This is the bottom of the curve. She went from way down here to back up on the growth curve after we started this intervention. No $1 million medicine, no fancy medical device, treating the root cause of the problem, which was childhood adversity. Now, there are many interventions that the research is telling us helps to make a difference in reducing stress hormones and reducing the impact of toxic stress, right? And some of these I outline in the book, sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, and healthy relationships. And there's one other piece that is also critically important, which is understanding that when you look at the definition of toxic stress that was generated by the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, right? It's activation of the stress response and the changes that happen to a child's brain and body in absence of sufficient buffering by a caregiver. But in order for us to be safe, stable, nurturing relationships for children, in order for the adults in a child's life to be able to be this buffer, they themselves need to have a well-regulated stress response. And I have seen kids with all kinds of ACE scores. I've seen kids in lots of different circumstances. And people often ask, like, oh, well, can you ask these questions in the doctor's office? Aren't people sensitive? Isn't it too invasive? I will say it because I'm like, please, I have to look at children's genitals every day. Like, really? I can look down there, but I can't ask 10 questions? Come on. It's a matter of like what we're trying to do and how we do it, right? But parents and caregivers need to be well regulated. And as I said, I've seen kids who have been exposed to all kinds of things, but I have never, and I've been thinking about this now for some time. I don't think I've ever seen a child with a high ACE score whose caregiver who had no ACEs. This is transmitted from generation to generation. And most often the scenario is that the parent or the caregiver, right, they themselves have an overactive stress response. And so oftentimes it's more difficult for them to be able to provide these safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments for kids. And in the case of Lila, the great thing about child-parent psychotherapy is that it's a two-generation intervention. The therapist works with both the parent and the child at the same time to help recognize how trauma and adversity is not only impacting the child, but is impacting the relationship, the attachment, and the ability of the caregiver to provide the safe and stable relationship. And that, in fact, reducing the dose of adversity and enhancing the capacity of caregivers to be a buffer, right? Like, that's the cure. There's no like miracle cure here. That does, and this is what the research is showing us, can help to heal the disrupted stress response and normalize the neuroendocrine immune system. So we got to put our own oxygen masks on first, and we have to understand how to do that for the people we love, the people that we care for. So now that we have the science and we know a little bit about what the root cause is, now it's time for the revolution. And when I'm talking about revolution, listen, I'm a pediatrician. I got my background in public health, but this issue touches every single system and sector across our nation, whether you're dealing with the educational system, right? In our research, we found that kids in our practice who are exposed to 4 or more adverse childhood experiences were 32.6 times as likely to have learning and behavior problems in school as our kids with 0 adverse childhood experiences. By the way, all in the same neighborhood, all in Bayview Hunters Point, all the same community, primarily Black and brown kids. But if our kids had 0 adverse childhood experiences, only 3% of them had learning and behavior problems. And for those with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, 51.2%. More did than didn't have learning and behavior problems. That's profound. I'm just going to say this because I just want you to, like, when you think about the number of smokers that get lung cancer, it's not 51.2%, right? I just like put that in your mind about how strong of an effect size that is. But we are talking about across education, across juvenile justice, across healthcare, early childhood, and BT dubs, we're not just talking about kids, we are also talking about the next generation, right? So when we're thinking about our police officers and folks in every sector across our country, this issue is a major issue as far as the success of our American enterprise that we are trying to do. So how do we build a public health movement? Well, number one, it starts with sounding the alarm on this public health crisis, right? And then packaging the message out, getting it out in ways that people can digest and understand, and by the way, that can self-replicate, okay? The reason I wrote this book is because I want to get this message out, but I'm also a mom. My husband and I have 4 kids. I do not have the capacity to fly everywhere around the country and shout the message to every single person, right? So we need to, for all of us in the audience, to think about how do we do this work and still practice self-care for ourselves, right? By putting these messages out there in ways where it becomes embedded in part of our cultural messaging, right? And so literally, whether it's a book or a blog post or a TED Talk or whatever it is, getting it out there in ways that people can spread and share the message is critically important. Engaging strategic champions, again. So one of the interesting pieces, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with Hillbilly Elegy, which was J.D. Vance's best-selling book about his experience growing up in Appalachia, right? And this is a guy, a lot of people read the book to understand the Trump phenomenon, right? White guy growing up in, rural America. But at the end of his book, he talks about everything that he experienced were adverse childhood experiences, right? And that was what was ailing Appalachia, right? So messages that people can own for themselves. And then the last piece, and this is where we are now in the movement, because it's starting to get out there, is building networks. We need to build the infrastructure to allow us to be able to work across systems, to be able to sustain this work and this movement in a way that is self-sustaining and that is just a matter of how we do business. And I'm going to end with a little reading from the book, if you all will indulge me. This is from the epilogue, right? So this is the end of the book, and it'll probably take about 5 minutes to read. So I hope we're okay on time. And there's one piece I got to throw in there so it'll make sense to you. When I was a kid, so I have 4 brothers. I'm destined to be around a lot of testosterone. And when I was a kid, my dad, whenever he'd come up on the 5 of us, acting crazy and, throwing paper airplanes at each other, my dad would stop and he'd say, oh, most parents would be like, you stop or you're going to poke each other's eye out. So my dad, who's a biochemist, he, instead of yelling at us, would say, oh, if you're launching that paper airplane, you got to measure, check your velocity and time your throws to see, which direction it's going to go. And that really informed my experience growing up in seeing the whole world through the scientific lens. Everything could be processed through the lens of physics and biology and chemistry. So that's just a little thing for you to keep in mind as you hear this last piece. It's 2040, and things are a little different. I'm a grandmother now, but wouldn't you know it? I still look good. I'm retired, and when I'm not putzing around in my garden, I keep busy chasing the grandkids. They are 4, 5, and 7, and of course, I spoil them rotten. the guilty pleasure of every grandparent since the beginning of time. Our eldest sons, the twins, are 37, and I'm in love with my daughters-in-law, who both called me directly after their prenatal appointments to tell me that they had an ACE screening as part of routine prenatal care. Even though it's standard nowadays, they know how much I still love to hear about doctors following through on the guidelines that CYW helped develop. Our boys just roll their eyes when their wives indulge me as I rattle on with my back in the day stories. But I know that they're secretly proud each time they fill out school forms for their kids and see the checked box that certifies that each child has received an ACE screening right along with vaccinations and TB tests. Gray Boo, that's my youngest, Gray, who now insists on being called by his proper name, teaches 3rd grade at a public elementary school. He gives me the ACE scoop from the other side of the desk, telling me how school incorporates ACE awareness into its teacher training. One of the first things the school makes sure of is that teachers know how to recognize the symptoms of toxic stress in their students. Every morning, Gray guides his class with a quiet time meditation practice, reinforcing the self-regulation skills they've been working on throughout the year. Even though I'm retired, I still make time to teach at least one course on ACEs and toxic stress to the first-year medical students at Stanford, where Kingston, our second to youngest, is now part of the class. We start at the beginning of the semester with the biological mechanisms, and by the end, we're discussing the latest interventions for healing a disrupted neuroendocrine immune system. On the public health side of things, the movement has taken off. 2 decades ago, CYW was instrumental in convening a group of advocacy and education organizations led by the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, and the American Lung Association, and together, they created a powerful public education campaign. It started with a viral video and spun out from there. Billboards, posters in doctors' offices, a Super Bowl ad, and more. Celebrities volunteer to be part of the Faces of ACEs campaign, and they share their stories along with the call to action. Know your score and learn how to heal. My son's generation is the first to grow up into adulthood without the stigma surrounding adversity. These days, having an ACE score isn't any more shameful than having a peanut allergy. But the campaign did far more than change attitudes. 20+ years later, we have seen a 40% decline in the number of Americans reporting 1 or more ACEs, and a 60% decline in the number of Americans reporting 4 or more ACEs. Adverse events still happen to all kinds of people, but they are no longer handed down from generation to generation to generation. The Resilience Investment Act of 2020, which provided federal dollars for screening, treatment, and research, created a national consortium modeled after the Children's Oncology Group that is wildly successful. The double-digit decline in healthcare spending allows us to reallocate dollars to national priorities in some predictable and some surprising ways. Our increased allocation to early childhood care and education programs was a no-brainer. The big surprise came when I got a call from the US State Department asking me to help advise on a new program that will work closely with other nations' governments to deploy widespread ACE screening and early intervention in high conflict areas. This way, we can inoculate the younger generation so they will not be susceptible to induction into gangs, militias, and insurgencies. The science of toxic stress has become a powerful tool in maintaining global security. And our military also uses the latest treatments to help our troops returning from combat. Ultimately, I help where I can, but for the most part, there isn't much for me to do. What started out as a movement has become just how people do things, basic infrastructure, standard of medical practice, common wisdom. So Arno and I, my husband, and I spend most of our time just being grandparents. We take our grandkids to the park, we buy them things we know we shouldn't, and when I come across my grandkids chucking paper airplanes at one another, I grab my tape measure and my stopwatch and laugh as they all roll their eyes and flee before the science lesson begins. All of them, that is, except one. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Am I staying up here?
So in the interim, to move things along, so Doctor, thank you, thank you, thank you. My name is Renee Wilson Simmons. I'm director of the National Center for Children in Poverty here at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, and also a member of Trauma Free NYC. And I have the honor and the pleasure of moderating this next portion of the program, which will be a short period of question and answer. I don't think we have a lot of time, but I think it's important to get a few questions answered. So we have some, so please, you can feel free to take a seat. So we have some wonderful volunteers, but I don't see them at the at the mics. And so if you'll raise your hand, and the mic will be passed to you. And if you can wait until you're called upon so that everyone can hear your question, because we'll give you the mic. And just one request, because our time is limited, please, one question only. And don't get tricky with a three-part question, just in a follow-up question, just one question only. Okay, right here.
Thank you. Hello? Is this on?
No.
Is it on now? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fabulous. What do you mean all except one?
Oh yeah, you got to read the book. But what I didn't mention in my little preamble to the reading is that when my dad would come and do all that, the measurements and the sciencey stuff, all my brothers would run in the other direction. And they thought it was irritating. I thought it was fascinating. And so I loved it.
So one thing I want to ask you as the prerogative, as the moderator, very quickly. So I'm saying to people, this book is phenomenal. It's inspirational, it's educational, and you have a voice that's so clear in the writing, to the point that as I was reading, I began to feel like I knew you. I knew you. Some of it very funny, some of it very poignant. And I have to, and toward the very end is when you shared some very deep and personal things about your life. And I wonder, and it was surprising because I felt like I knew you, and how could I think that? I didn't. But when I got to the end, I wondered, was there a struggle to share that much?
Yes. And I'm not going to give a spoiler for those of you who have not read the book. With this entire book, I left it all on the field. This work is my absolute passion. I think that you only get one. I don't intend to write another book.
You never know.
But I had this really, in fact, I wasn't even intending to write a first book, but I got the opportunity. Someone reached out to me after seeing my TED Talk. And so keep in mind, I'm running a center. I'm also still practicing as a pediatrician. A lot of this book was written between 4:30 and 8:30 in the morning. Don't talk, I know about self-care. But I felt like a lot of the things that I have put in this book come from they're my whole self. And yeah, when you read it, you get a sense of who I am. That's the real me. And that's what I put in the book.
Thank you. Yes, in the black right there. Mhm. Mhm.
When I first heard your TED Talk, I felt like my own thoughts were coming out of you because, yeah, preach it from the mountaintop. Like, why aren't we doing this earlier? And as I start this initiative in my own community in Vancouver, Canada, one of the pushback I'm getting from some of the psychologists and stuff is, shouldn't we balance the ACE screening with resilience? Because they're so worried that with us screening, that it's going to open up this Pandora's box and they're going to leave the office and want to do harmful things. So I'm curious from your experience how you've countered that, if you've countered that too.
Yeah, Vince Felitti, who is the co-principal investigator of the ACE study, said that when he initially proposed doing the ACE study, it was very difficult for him to get it past the Institutional Review Board. And the reason was because they insisted that asking these questions would open up this Pandora's box. People would become suicidal. It would be really just this, and it was dangerous for patients. And Dr. Felitti has shared with me the story that he was required, in order to get this past the IRB, he was required to carry a pager 24/7 for 3 years while they were enrolling the study. And the pager never went off once. Rather, what happened was he got incredible numbers of letters and calls of saying, "Oh my God, thank you so much for asking. I thought I would die and no one would ever ask." Now, that being said, I don't want to be, I want to be mindful and heedful of what our colleagues are talking about. And at the Center for Youth Wellness, we use an ACE screen that is included at the back of the book, where we do what's called a de-identified screen. So we say, you don't have to tell us which ones of these your child has experienced, only how many. And what that allows us to do is two things. Number one, in order to screen everyone, we need to screen in primary care. And we have 15, maybe 20 minutes if you're lucky. So we need to figure out a screen that can be performed and where you can have a disposition in a relatively, in the context of that visit. And that's what the de-identified screen allows us to do. But the second piece about it that I've really learned is that when I identify, if I have a patient who has high ACEs and I refer them on to a mental health colleague, that mental health colleague has the time, the training, the capacity to unpack that high ACE score in a way that is really sensitive, and also in a way so that patient, okay, so they may see me this time, they see someone else the next time, they see someone, as it sometimes may happen, especially in academic medical centers or something along the line. And so it's really respectful of holding that balance between disclosure, but then also surveillance, right? So.
Okay, in the back, the young man in the back there.
Hi, Dr. Burke. I am so honored to be here to hear you talk. As soon as I saw your TED Med talk, I had a eureka moment. I went and LinkedIn requested you and started getting everything. But I work with the city, New York City and New York State Departments of Health around as a consumer and patient advocate, predominantly around HIV. And I find that, a lot of the individuals at this point are not in pediatric care, they're older. So what hope is there for someone who has grown into adolescence or even young adult for addressing these issues?
It's never too late to begin that journey of healing when it comes to ACEs and toxic stress. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that when we talk about, for example, neuroplasticity, right? Because we're talking about how early adversity changes the way that our brains work. There are two types of neuroplasticity. There's synaptic plasticity, that's a connection from one brain cell, which is the number of brain cells that are talking to each other. And synaptic plasticity, which is connection from one brain cell to the next, and cellular plasticity, which is the number of brain cells that talk to each other. And Cellular plasticity, so synaptic, let me not get too deep into the weeds, but the point is one of them is like changing your voice from a whisper to a shout. That's synaptic plasticity. And cellular plasticity is like the difference between a person shouting and a whole stadium shouting. And the latter, 90% happens by the 6th birthday, right? So most of that is in early childhood. But the former is lifelong, right? So we can actually, neuroplasticity happens throughout our lives. And we have the opportunity to change the way that our brains are, I will say, wired, for want of a better word, in response to our environments. And some of the things that I talk about outlined in the book, for example, meditation, which I talk a little bit about, a lot of the research on how meditation impacts health has been done in adult populations. And that's one of the things that we've really intentionally tried to look at, is looking at both the health consequences of having an overactive stress response in childhood and also the consequences in adulthood, and looking at interventions. Some of the modifications to diet in terms of low, high protein, low refined foods, low sugar, low fat diet, things that we already know that it's good for us, but what this tells us is one additional reason of why it's good for us in terms of the impact on inflammation, on hormones, et cetera. So it's never too late to be addressing the impacts of an overactive stress response. The last piece that I would say is keep in mind that the work we do in my pediatric practice, again, is this 2-generation work. We have to be addressing these issues in caregivers in order to be able to provide these safe, stable, and nurturing relationship in kids. So the same sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, and healthy relationships, those 6 things that we see can improve outcomes for kids, they can also improve outcomes for adults. It's never too late.
Okay, can we go back there? Mm-hmm.
Hello. I'm just curious if you could speak to the intersection between protective factors and ACEs, and then speak a little bit to when you develop the network in the revolution, what does the network do outside of the medical field?
Oh my goodness, where to begin? So, so in terms of protective factors, and I realized as you said that there was a second part to her question.
Yes, thank you.
There was.
Thank you.
So I think that this is one of the things that we're really excited about, the research around protective factors and understanding not only what factors are protective in terms of safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, you know, regular exercise, certain types of nutrition, all of those things are really important. The question in terms of screening for protective factors, I think, is a little bit of a challenge, and I think it's a good audience for me to talk for a second about why. The fact that childhood adversity is associated with negative outcomes is as old as the hills and twice as dusty, right? Like, we've known about this for a really long time, and it's a little bit of a truism. And that is actually part of the problem that's working against us, because people think that they know what this problem is and they think they already know why, right? Oh, it's because those people have bad behavior. And what the science of, what the ACE study did and the science of toxic stress has done is it has gone through and explained the why and the how, and filled in with scientific information these steps that take us from one place to another, that brings a level of credibility to this work, which is different than what it's experienced before. And one of the challenges, one of the things that I think is an exciting opportunity for us is with the science of resilience, we need to be equally as rigorous in filling in the gaps of how these, we need to know not only which factors are protective, but why and how, and what is the scientific underpinning. Because I promise, anytime we are trying to do work that is paradigm shifting, right? that is changing our societal norms, there will be pushback, right? It's really cute that we're all here right now, like having this conversation, and we're really in the minority in terms of this knowledge, right? But as it gains greater understanding and knowledge, I mean, I'm just going to say, it's a public health audience, so I can say, I mean, let's just look at vaccines, right? It's like, you know, one of the greatest health developments of the 20th century in terms of preventing disease, and yet there are still, you know, folks going on TV saying, oh, vaccines are terrible, don't vaccinate your kids, right? So there will be pushback coming, and we really need to have the strong and rigorous science to help to fill in those blanks and help people understand why and how this happens.
Thank you.
We're limited on time, yeah. You'll have to read the book to get more on the, what does it look like in other sectors? Chapter 11.
Yeah, so I see some other hands, and I swear to you, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but our time is up. But now remember, I know, but remember, we have a reception following. We want to give the doctor a brief 15-minute break. Sorry, it's going to be so brief. Before the reception begins, the books are on sale, and there'll be an opportunity to purchase a book and to have Dr. Burke sign it. So we're going to have to end this portion, but I want to thank you profusely again. You have been really a leader in charting a path forward and helping to heal the adversity of children. And I want to thank all of you out here, because I hope what you have heard inspires you, but not just inspires you, but inspires you to take action, whether you're a parent or a caregiver or a health or mental health provider or a member of the faith community or a researcher or an advocate or a human being, just a human being. I hope that what you've heard encourages you to learn more and to do more. And I know it's trite, but it's true. Nothing happens if nothing happens. So we really have to move forward. We have to do something and not just be inspired and tell our friends about it and go on. We all have a role to play in this. And so I thank you, and I thank the audience.
Thank you.